Welcome for some fresh sword content. Now if you've seen my recent video on the Windlass 1796, you know I had some issues with that sword that made me pretty unhappy. But I also mentioned in that video that I had taken advantage of a really good Museum Replicas pre-holiday sale, picked up a couple of 3 pieces, and this was one of them. A new product in their lineup that they're calling the Sword of St. Michael. Okay, for me, automatically awesome. That's my namesake. Maybe they made it for me. And we'll talk about how it really does suit me. But after the 1796 left that sour taste in my mouth, I'm going to say that while this sword, yeah, it does have its issues, but there is more than enough good about it that, yeah, this one made me happy. Let's start as we usually do with the scabbard, and yes, compared to that 1796, a huge difference in both quality and my frustration level. You've got some decorative features on the throat and the chape, at least on the outside facing side. The inside facing sides are plain. That's also where the stitching is. And the construction I'm going to call leather wood leather. So you've got a reasonably nice matching to the grip brown, kind of almost a dark tan leather coating, and I don't know if I'm going to keep it this color. I might actually dye it. It's on nice and clean, nice and tight. You've got a fairly decorative stitched seam on the inside, and I'm calling it leather wood leather because that leather is over a pretty stout wood core, so it is rigid. But also, if I look down inside, there are a couple of little thin leather inserts in here that help with retention. Now, when I first got it, it was kind of snug, kind of tight, but over time it has indeed been loosening up, breaking in. I expect it will continue to, but right now, retention is good, and yeah, not a whole lot of rattle in there. So I'm going to say, for what it is, good scabbard. Before we get any further in the video, I should talk about where Windlass apparently got their inspiration for the design. They seem to have taken it from a 15th century painting by Antonio Pollaiuolo. I'm Sicilian and I'm having trouble pronouncing that name. But Antonio is portraying St. Michael fighting the devil in the form of a Great Dane-sized dragon in blackened armor, looking rather emo, armed with, interestingly enough, a small buckler, strange choice if you're going to go fight a dragon, and instead of what St. Michael is often portrayed with, which is usually something longer and double-edged, at least a sizable arming sword, if not a hand and a half or a long sword, he decided to go with a falchion of the period. So some interesting choices for taking on a not terribly impressively sized dragon. Close-up mode to talk about the friendly end, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on down here. Starting with the guard. It's not a substantial amount of hand protection. There's nothing on the sides. But I'm going to call this sort of half of an S-guard, and I really like S-guards. But on the back, you've got a straight quillin, which is pretty beefy, and it's got some concaveness to it, so I feel like it could actually catch something coming down the backside. I was a little concerned with the knuckle bow. It looks like it thins out quite a lot, especially right here before it ends in this sort of conical, almost dragon tail shape. But having it in hand, yeah, there's some good beef to that there. I would not go out of my way to abuse it, but I feel like I've got a reasonable amount of protection for what it is. You know, there was an issue with the final finishing we'll get back to, but the other big feature we need to talk about, literally big feature, is this sizable wheel pommel that's 2 inches in diameter, 5 centimeters. It is tapered, which is nice. And yes, we are talking about a peen construction. It sort of has a little bit of a rectangular integral peen block of sorts that makes the peen, well, very clean. No gaps, no flaws, doesn't really look battered. So that's all good. But again, there was one finishing issue on here. Talking about the grip first. Okay, so you've got a leather-covered grip that has a riser in the middle, and it's got that pressed-in sort of string texture to it. glued down seam that is really clean. It's pretty much invisible. I can't feel it at all. Now it does look like it has copper braided Turk's heads top and bottom, but those are one-piece castings, kind of like bolsters, so that was a little disappointing. But for the price point, I understand why you might need to cut some corners, and at least there's no sharp wire bits or anything sticking out. But some of the dimensions were kind of surprising in the middle here. It is kind of a short grip at 3 3/4 inches, 9.5 centimeters. So my medium width hands, yeah, there's enough room for them with a little bit of wiggle room. But then you combine that with the taper of the grip, and I am relying a lot on that wheel pommel for control, leverage, retention, which we'll talk about in that finish issue. But it is also surprisingly slim side to side. Really wasn't expecting this. That is only 9/16 of an inch, 13 millimeters. It almost feels like somebody just wrapped a little bit of leather over the tang. It's very flat, slim feeling in hand, which also tends to make me rely a lot more on that wheel pommel for retention. Now, I have learned to work with wheel pommels and really appreciate what they do. And we'll talk about that more in handling, but okay, that finishing issue. This came to me with the edges, the corners of the wheel pommel and the corners of the guard facing my hand really, really sharp. So I had to take some time with some sandpaper to dehorn it, round off those edges, so it wouldn't hurt me when I handled it. All right, time to talk about the business end, the good, the meh, and am I going to make any changes to it? Currently going for $350 US on museum replicas. I'll put the link in the description. You're getting a 1075 carbon steel blade that my test files are saying somewhere in the low 50s HRC, probably around 52, which is fine for a through-hardened mono steel sword blade. No problems there. Now your blade profile and length, I tend to say Falchion, maybe Grossmesser. That's certainly not a Grossmesser grip. With some interesting design choices, starting with, yes, it has a diamond cross-section. And it's pretty well done, pretty crisp with a brush finish. There is a little bit of waviness in the blade, but it's not bad. Comes with a clip point. So I have an S-guard that I really like on bladed weapons and a clip point I really love on Bowie-style knives. So yeah, there's some features I appreciate. I also like diamond cross-sections. It was not supposed to come sharpened from the factory, but it did. Most of the way down the primary edge, it was a steep bevel, so I went ahead and improved it a little bit. It was not sharpened on the false, on the clip. So I went ahead and put an edge on that. And I am tempted, aesthetically speaking, to take that clip point down maybe about an inch, which might give me also more cutting capacity on the back cut, and it might change the weight and balance just a little bit as well. Now the rest of the false is not sharpened. There's about 1 millimeter of blunt on there, and I am not tempted to put an edge on that. Let's keep it a single edge, mostly sword. But as for the other dynamics of it and my comfort zones with the bladed weapons, okay, for its size, it is surprisingly dense at 2 pounds, 8.5 ounces, about 1,148 grams. Yes, I'm looking down at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial. With a point of balance, 4 inches, 10 centimeters into the blade. And the blade length, again, we're going for something falchion-sized, 26.5 inches, 67.3 centimeters. So for me, at least, the weight, the point of balance, and the blade length does make it very similar to a number of Japanese-style swords I have. So again, I have some comfort zones, some familiarity with the way this blade feels and handles. It's really working for me. Some issues though. Okay, profile and distal taper pretty much non-existent. Now there is some profile taper. It goes from about 1 3/4 inches to the base of the clip point. That's 1 9/16. So it's about 4.5 centimeters and 4 centimeters. So just about 5 millimeters of profile taper. Distal taper, though, is pretty much non-existent. Down here at the base, it's 4 millimeters. At the ogive of the tip, it's 3.5. So kind of a slab of steel that way. Might even consider it maybe machete-like, which is not unusual for a falchion-style blade. But yeah, when it comes to distal flex, it is a pretty stiff blade. But when it does flex, it's right through the middle. There's no distal flex. All right, let's go ahead and roll in the test footage, and we'll talk about how it did in the performance tests, and then, yeah, we're going to talk about how it handles for me. For the edge, let's go ahead and do the cardboard test. Yeah, I'm going to say that's pretty nice. No damage. Summary of test results, starting with thrusting and stabbing first into my pell, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper up against my redwood target, and then to test into harder media straight into the redwood. What am I looking for? Well, in the softer media, penetration and channel. And yeah, this clip point tip geometry was awesome at both. As a matter of fact, I had trouble pulling it out of that media a couple of times. It bit so deep. Into the harder media, I'm testing tip durability, and that's actually a pretty well reinforced tip, so it didn't take any damage. Second part of the test is to see how the sword flexes under that kind of impact. So I'm thrusting with the blade horizontal to the camera so you can see it flex. And you might have saw it spring just a little bit, but yeah, it's a pretty stiff blade. It didn't really bend at all under that kind of impact. And speaking of impact, the third part of the test is how does it translate that linear impact back into my hand? Does my hand stay put? Any uncomfortable collisions? And well, all right, I talked about the sharpest edges on the guard that I rounded off a little bit. Apparently, I didn't round them off enough. I wouldn't necessarily call the grip slippy. Maybe a little bit, because that leather finish is kind of slick, but it is textured. There's a riser in the middle, and there's not a whole lot of room for my hand to move anyway. But yeah, especially into the harder media, I was having some really uncomfortable collisions with those corners, went back to the shop, rounded them out even more, and that pretty much fixed the problem. And we'll talk about sharp corners again here in a second. But the next test, hacking and slashing into a piece of dry bamboo to see if I can induce chip or roll on a fragile edge. Even improving this edge, making it keener, I didn't expect it to take any damage, and it didn't. And between its geometry and being just a little bit blade forward, yeah, it hacked impressively into that hard media. Now, I'm not trying to hack through that bamboo. I'm hitting it with basically the speed, pressure, rhythm I would use when I'm fencing, which also gives me the opportunity to see how the sword moves and responds when it gets to, well, bounce off something. And yeah, this is a very nimble, maneuverable weapon. So far, so great. Moving on to the cutting tests. Now this time I used a variety of different thickness and width cardboard panels, which basically mimic different sizes of water bottles. And yeah, this sword did awesome cutting through them at all sorts of various angles. Again, I only improved that edge bevel a little bit. Really impressed with how well it did in the cutting tests. It was quite a pleasure to cut with, except for, okay, back to sharp corners. This is where I started to feel the sharp corners on the disc pommel. So back to the shop, dehorned that a little bit more, fixed it. Now if I was wearing a glove, probably wouldn't feel it whatsoever. But okay, let's take all of those results and roll them into my Marshall handling impressions. Let's go ahead and quickly tick through my list of sword evaluation criteria, starting with specs. Does it fit me? I'm going to say yes, absolutely. I really like the way it feels, really like the way it moves. We'll get back to that. But I've talked about how the blade length, weight, and balance reminds me a whole lot of Japanese style swords, which is a specific comfort zone for me. Also, a blade that's a bit shorter is handier and, yes, safer for indoor training. Where I live, I have pretty much 6 months of dark, endless rain, sometimes snow, so I don't get outside to train very often, so all my training happens indoors. Also, my opportunistic training, where I have a couple of minutes here and there throughout the day, take a break from work, get up and move, pick up a weapon, run through some combinations, some drills. Yeah, I'm probably going to pick up something a little shorter, a little handier in tighter spaces, which is why overall I don't spend a lot of time with long swords. This is one I've been picking up frequently for that, so it's becoming a favorite. Now, I did have to get used to the really slim grip, but it didn't take long before I really started liking it. We'll talk about the disc pommel again in just a minute, but moving on to the next criteria, which is actually 2 criteria summed up by somebody asking if a sword is battle ready. Part 1 of that is, will it cut? Oh yes, absolutely, very well, with, well, pretty much minimal edge improvement on my part. Second part of battle ready, can I hit stuff with it? Is it durable? And so far, it's held together just fine. I don't have any concerns about the durability of the build. If anything, Windlass tends to overbuild stuff. But I think they got a really good balance between nimble specs and durable specs here. And then, finally, how does it perform for me martially? My 3 martial evaluation criteria are offensive capability, defensive capability, and its maneuverability responsiveness. Would I feel confident using it against an unpredictable reactive opponent who may also be armed in various different ways, which also gets us into the subject of potential for cross-training with it. But as for the offensive, starting with the tip, I really do love a clip point on a knife, and I'm getting that here in a sword. So I'm getting that penetration and channel, but also the angle of that tip and the way I can get it around corners, even though it's not a curved sword. And then, of course, being able to use that sharpened back edge with its clip point profile to make very effective back cuts and back slashes. Now, I might extend that edge a little bit further down, as I said, to get more of that, but I feel like it's got enough to do the job. Also, since it's just a partial back edge, I do have lots of blunt here to safely and comfortably half sword with. We talked about how this weapon is length, weight, and balance-wise very similar, at least for me, to a Japanese style sword. So yeah, that's another set of tools for my toolkit that I can make really good use of. As for the primary edge, it's absolutely a great cutter with good blade authority without being unwieldy, so I feel like I can get very good, effective, quick, responsive slashes, which include tip slashes and very powerful cuts. Yeah, it really does work for me confidently. Offensively speaking, and speaking of confidence, let's go ahead and talk about its defensive capability. Feels solid enough in my hand with good blade presence, inertia. I would feel, yes, absolutely confident stopping, parrying, displacing, beating, or bearing on an opponent's weapon. And I feel like I have just enough guard that I would feel confident in it stopping something sliding down the front or the back edge. Would I like more on the side? Yes, absolutely. But there's a give and take in terms of weight and carryability and other things, and you can always compensate for a sword that has less guard, not only with your technique, but also with something supplemental in your other hand. So would this work with something like a shield or a buckler? Oh yeah, absolutely, very well. So that's one use I've been putting it to. It is fundamentally a falchion, which makes it also Dusak, Messer. It could, however, be wielded like, say, an arming sword, or even a side sword. And when it comes to cross training, yes, I've been using it in one-handed Japanese-style sword techniques. Also, trying a little bit of saber out with it, even though it doesn't have the curve, or broadsword, backsword, without the hand protection. Again, there's certain compensations I need to make. Could I also theoretically use it as a Chinese gen? Yeah, I could do that as well. So when it comes to its handiness and maneuverability, I feel like I have a good balance of it having a great blade authority, inertia for cutting and parrying without being unwieldy. It moves really well for me. Once I get used to that skinny grip, yeah, it just works. And it's a weapon I've been picking up and training with opportunistically quite frequently through a variety of different, well, toolkits and disciplines. So yeah, all around, it does really suit me, appeal to me. I can make a lot of use out of it. I can even use that wheel pommel as an impact tool if I wanted to. And let's talk about that for a minute. Some people like these, some people really hate them. What wheel pommels can do for you, well, first of all, let's consider if this is your secondary backup weapon, you might need to reach for it in an emergency because somebody got past, defeated your primary. So if you're having to reach down and grab this quickly under adrenaline, you may be wearing heavy gloves or gauntlets, that wheel makes a really positive grip, kind of grabs your hand back and allows you to draw it without fumbling. But also, it is a solid wheel. People will ask me that. Not only are you getting the counterbalance, but I've learned how to work with them in terms of planting them in the heel of my hand. Not only does that give me a very positive grip, my hand's not going to slide off the end of the grip, but learn how to use that to just put a little press on the wheel. Not only does it help me with edge alignment, but gives the sword a little bit of extra push so I can use it in even finer techniques and maneuvers. So that does also, for me, increase the use of the weapon. It's also something I might do if I'm using it in combination with a shield buckler or something else in my other hand. So, yeah, it gives it just a little bit more nimbleness for me. But, all right. I can certainly go on and on about this sword all day. I could probably wield it all day. I almost feel like I have certain days. I've been using it quite a lot. So, needless to say, really appreciating my purchase. I think it's absolutely worth it. For me, definitely fits. But let's go ahead and cut the conversation off here. If you have any questions about this, if you have other single-handed, single-edged cut and thrust swords, let me know about those. Keep your recommendations coming. Otherwise, as always, I don't know what's coming up next. Again, I'm going to try to balance the knife reviews and the sword reviews and get around to those hawks and hatchets. But thank you all so much for watching, liking the videos, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, and I hope to see you back for whatever I get around to next. It's probably going to be a knife review.